You have 10 minutes to leave the property, the sheriff said, his voice calm, almost rehearsed, like he'd delivered that line 100 times before, but this time it landed differently, because this time, he was standing on my front porch, and my parents were behind him, watching me like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome in a place I'd called home for 29 years. I remember the exact weight of my keys in my hand, the way my fingers tightened around them, like somehow gripping harder would make this moment unreal, like I could rewind the last 24 hours and wake up to something else, something that made sense, but nothing about this made sense, not the notice taped to the door, not the locks that had already been changed, not the way my mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and definitely not the way my father stood there with his arms crossed, like this. Was just another business decision he'd already justified in his head. You heard him, Emily, my mom said, her tone flat, controlled, the same voice she used when she talked to customer service reps or waiters who got her order wrong, like I wasn't her daughter, like I was just another inconvenience she needed to clear out of the way, pack whatever you have left and go. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity of it all hit me at once, the idea that they thought I still had anything inside that house, the idea that they thought I hadn't already seen this coming, the idea that they believed this moment was the end of something for me, when in reality, it was just the beginning of something they weren't prepared for. This is my house, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how small they sounded compared to the certainty in theirs, compared to the confidence my father had when he stepped forward and shook his head like he was correcting a child. Not anymore, he replied, his voice steady, final, the same tone he used years ago when he told me I wasn't worth investing in, when he decided which child mattered and which one didn't, when he made it clear that everything in this family had a hierarchy and I was at the bottom of it. Behind him, I could see the new deadbolt on the door, bright brass catching the afternoon light, a detail so small and so deliberate it made my chest tighten, because it meant they hadn't just decided this overnight, they had planned it, ordered the locks, scheduled the change, coordinated everything down to the minute, and somehow, I was the last one to know. The sheriff shifted his weight slightly, glancing between us, clearly uncomfortable but not surprised, because situations like this probably played out every day, just with different faces and different families, and I wondered how many times he'd watched parents remove their own child from a home, how many times he'd stood there while someone realized they didn't belong where they thought they did. Ma'am, he said gently, I just need you to comply so we can avoid any further issues. Further issues. The phrase echoed in my head, and for a second, I closed my eyes, not in defeat, not in surrender, but to steady myself, to hold on to the one thing they didn't know, the one thing that had been set in motion long before this moment, long before they filed whatever paperwork they thought gave them control, long before they convinced themselves this was legally airtight. Because 3 years ago, while they were busy deciding how to cut me out, I was quietly putting pieces together, signing documents they never saw, building something they never imagined I was capable of, something that didn't just protect me, but positioned me in a way they wouldn't understand until it was too late. I opened my eyes again and looked at the sheriff, then at my parents, really looked at them, at the certainty on their faces, the expectation that I would break, argue, plead, that I would do what I had always done, which was accept whatever role they assigned me and try to survive within it. But I wasn't that version of myself anymore. 10 minutes is more than enough, I said quietly, and this time, my voice didn't shake. My mom frowned slightly, like something about my response didn't fit the script she had in her head, like she was waiting for the part where I protested, where I begged her to reconsider, where I asked what I did wrong, but that part never came, because I already knew the answer, and more importantly, I knew something. She didn't. I stepped back from the door, setting my keys down on the small wooden table by the porch, the same table that had been there since I was a kid, the same table where I used to leave notes for them, hoping they'd read them, hoping they'd understand me, hoping for something that never came, and for a brief moment, I felt that old version of myself flicker, the one who still wanted their approval, the one who believed family meant something permanent, something unbreakable, but that version of me had been gone for a long time now, replaced by someone who had learned to read silence, to recognize patterns, to prepare for outcomes others refused to see. You don't get it, do you? My dad said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice now, like my calmness was irritating him, like it disrupted the clean ending he had envisioned. This is over. You have no claim here anymore. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel dismissed. I didn't feel like the afterthought in someone else's story. I felt steady. That's what you think, I said, and I could see it then, just for a second, the smallest crack in his expression, the briefest flicker of uncertainty that passed so quickly most people would have missed it, but I didn't miss it, because I had spent years studying these moments, learning exactly when confidence starts to shift into doubt. The sheriff checked his watch. "We're at 8 minutes, he said, not unkindly, just doing his job, keeping things moving, unaware that time was about to matter in a way none of them expected. I nodded, stepping off the porch and onto the driveway, the gravel crunching under my shoes, a sound I had heard thousands of times growing up, a sound that used to mean coming home, and now meant something entirely different, something final, something transitional. I picked up my bag, the only thing I had brought with me that morning, and as I walked past them, I didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't look back at the house, because the truth was, I didn't need to. They thought they were taking something from me. They thought they had already won. And the only reason I didn't correct them right then and there, the only reason I let them stand in that belief for just a little longer, was because what was coming next wouldn't just prove them wrong. It would change everything they thought they owned, everything they thought they controlled, and everything they thought they understood about me. I did not get far before my phone buzzed in my hand, a sharp vibration that cut through the quiet like a warning I had been expecting for years, and when I looked down at the screen, I saw a name I had not saved but knew by heart, Daniel Reeves, the attorney who had been quietly handling everything I never told my parents about, everything they never thought to question because they never thought I was capable of it. "It happened, did it not?" he said the second I answered, not even a greeting, just confirmation, like this was not a surprise but a step in a process we had already mapped out long ago. "They changed the locks this morning," I replied, my voice steady, my eyes drifting back to the house where my parents were still standing on the porch, talking to the sheriff, probably discussing timelines, next steps, things they believed they controlled. "Good," Daniel said, and that word would have sounded cold to anyone else, but to me, it sounded like a door opening, like a signal that everything was moving exactly as planned. "We are right on schedule," he continued, and I could hear papers shifting on his end, the quiet, precise movements of someone who dealt in facts, in documents, in ownership, not in emotions or assumptions. "They filed under the assumption that the property is solely in their name," he added, and I let out a small breath, not relief, but recognition, because that was exactly what I expected them to do, exactly the kind of move my father would make, confident, decisive, and completely blind to anything outside his own understanding. "They have no idea," I said, more to myself than to him, and Daniel gave a short, knowing pause. "No," he replied, "they do not." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my bag, the weight of it suddenly lighter, like something had shifted, like the balance had already started to tip, even if they could not see it yet. As I walked down the street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, I could feel the familiar pull of memory, the kind that does not ask for permission, the kind that drags you back whether you want it to or not, and before I knew it, I was no longer standing outside that house. I was sitting at the old dining table, 17 years old, watching my father tap his fork against his plate like he was about to make an announcement. "We need to be realistic about the future," he had said back then, his voice calm, measured, the same tone he used when discussing finances, investments, things that had value, and I remember the way my stomach tightened before he even finished the sentence, because I already knew how this would go. "Your brother has potential," he continued, glancing toward the empty chair that always seemed to hold more importance than anyone actually sitting at the table. "He understands business, he knows how to build something that lasts." Then his eyes shifted to me, not harsh, not angry, just dismissive in a way that felt worse than either. "You, Emily, you need stability. Something simple. Something safe." Safe. That was the word he used when he meant small, when he meant limited, when he meant not worth the risk. I remember gripping the edge of the table, the wood pressing into my palms as I tried to hold on to something solid, something that proved I was not invisible, but nothing came. "I got into the real estate program at State," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, but still there, still present, still trying. My mother did not even look up from her plate. "That is nice," she said, the same way she always said it, the same two words that managed to sound polite and dismissive at the same time. My father nodded once, like he was acknowledging a minor detail in a larger conversation. "If you pursue that," he said, "do not expect us to fund it. We need to focus our resources where they will actually grow. Where they will actually grow. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask why. I just nodded because that was what I had learned to do, to accept the role they assigned me, to take what little space I was given. And make it work. But that night, lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision I never told them about, a decision that had nothing to do with proving them wrong and everything to do with proving something to myself. If they were not going to invest in me, I would find a way to invest in myself. I would learn the system they trusted so much, the system they believed they controlled, and I would understand it better than they ever expected me to. 3 years later, sitting in a small office with Daniel for the first time, I signed a document that looked ordinary to anyone else, just another purchase agreement, just another property transfer, but to me it felt like the first real step into something they would never see coming. "This is just the beginning," Daniel had said back then, sliding the folder toward me, and I remember looking down at the page, at my name printed clearly across the top, and feeling something settle inside me, something steady, something certain. Back in the present, I reached the corner of the street and stopped, turning just slightly so I could see the row of houses stretching out in front of me, each one quiet, each one ordinary, each one part of something much larger than it appeared, and for the first time since I stepped off that porch, I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not because of what I had lost, but because of what they were about to realize, a realization that would not come all at once but piece by piece, document by document, until there was nothing left for them to deny. And the worst part for them would not be losing the house. It would be understanding that they never actually had it in the first place. I rented a car that afternoon, nothing flashy, just a gray sedan with a faint smell of coffee and fabric cleaner, the kind of car you forget about the moment you step out of it, which was exactly what I needed, something temporary, something quiet, something that did not draw attention while everything else was about to shift in a way Northwest one on that street was ready for, and as I drove past the row of houses again, slower this time, I watched the details I had memorized over the past 3 years, the white fence on number 12 that needed repainting, the blue shutters on number 16 that had been replaced last spring, the small crack in the driveway at number 20 that ran just under 3 feet long, details that most people would never notice, but I had studied them the way my father studied financial reports, because to him, value was numbers on a page, but to me, value was patterns, ownership, positioning, and control. My phone buzzed again, this time a text message, not from Daniel, but from an unknown number, and I did not need to open it to know who it was, because there was only one person who would reach out this quickly, only one person who would break silence, not to apologize, not to explain, but to assert something. I opened the message. "You left without signing anything. That does not change the outcome," my father wrote, no greeting, no emotion, just a statement, like he was closing a deal, like I was a line item he had already removed from the ledger. I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked my phone without responding, because anything I said now would only confirm what he already believed, that he was in control, that this was finished, that I had no leverage left, and the truth was, the less I said, the longer that belief would hold, and the more impact it would have when it finally broke. I turned onto Maple Ridge Lane, slowing the car as I approached the small office building on the corner, the same building where I had signed my first purchase agreement 3 years ago, the same place where everything had started quietly, without announcements, without family discussions, without anyone questioning where the money came from or why I was suddenly spending so much time learning contracts, zoning regulations, and property law. Back then, I had worked 2 jobs, one during the day at a property management firm where I handled maintenance requests and tenant complaints, and another at night reviewing listings, studying market trends, calculating numbers over and over until they made sense, until I could see opportunities where others saw risk, and every dollar I saved went into something small at first, something they would have dismissed immediately if they had known, a modest duplex 2 blocks away from our house, purchased under a limited liability company with a name that meant nothing to anyone but me. I remember sitting across from Daniel that first day, my hands steady but my heart moving faster than I let him see, as he explained the structure, the protections, the strategy, and at one point, he had paused, looking at me over the top of the document. "Most people do not start like this," he said, not questioning, just observing, and I had nodded, because most people had something I did not, most people had support, had backing, had someone willing to invest in them, and when you do not have that, you learn to build differently, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention. I am not most people, I had replied, and he had given a small, almost approving nod before sliding the pen toward me. Now, as I parked in front of that same building, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting everything in a softer light, I sat there for a moment, letting the past and present overlap, letting the weight of everything settle into something clear, something focused. This was not about proving them wrong. It never had been. It was about understanding a system they believed they owned and using it in a way they never expected. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the glass door reflecting my image back at me, and for a second, I saw both versions of myself at once, the one they dismissed and the one they never saw coming, and the difference between them was not luck, not timing, but choice, a series of decisions made quietly over time, each one building toward something they could not undo. Inside, the office was exactly the same neutral walls, the same quiet hum of the air conditioning, the same receptionist who looked up and offered a polite smile without recognizing me, because to most people, I was just another client, another name on a file, another transaction in a long list of transactions, and that anonymity had been my greatest advantage. "He is expecting you," she said after I gave my name, and I nodded, walking down the hallway that felt familiar in a way the house no longer did, because this place had never judged me, never measured my worth against someone else, never decided I was less than what I could become. As I reached Daniel's office, I paused for just a second, my hand on the door, and I thought about the message my father had sent, about the certainty in his words, about the way he believed this was already over, and I realized something that almost made me smile again. He was not wrong about one thing. This was an outcome. Just not the one he thought. I opened the door and stepped inside, and Daniel looked up from his desk, already holding a file that was thicker than anything I had signed 3 years ago. "It is time," he said simply, and I nodded, because what happened next was no longer about preparation. It was about revelation, and they had no idea how much there was to reveal. I sat across from Daniel as he opened the file, the sound of paper sliding against paper sharper than it should have been, like every document inside carried more weight than it looked, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because this was the point where everything we had built quietly over the past 3 years began to move into the open, where strategy turned into action, where preparation turned into consequence. "They filed under standard residential claim," Daniel said finally, his tone calm, precise, like he was reading from a script he had already memorized, "which means they are assuming ownership based on occupancy history and internal transfer documentation." I nodded slowly, because that sounded exactly like something my father would rely on, something that looked solid on the surface, something that worked in most cases, something that gave him the confidence to stand on that porch and tell me I had no claim. "And the surrounding properties?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though I had reviewed those documents more times than I could count. Daniel allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile as he turned a few pages and tapped the top sheet lightly. "All secured under Carter Holdings LLC," he said, and hearing it spoken out loud, in that office, in that moment, felt different than seeing it on paper, because this was no longer theoretical, no longer contained in quiet meetings and signed forms, this was real, immediate, and about to intersect with people who had no idea it existed. "Every parcel on that street has been transferred and recorded," he continued, "including the one they believe they control." I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that settle, not as a surprise, but as confirmation, as something that had been true for a long time, but had never needed to be said out loud until now. "They are planning to finalize a sale," Daniel added, flipping to another section of the file, and that made my attention sharpen, because timing mattered, because everything about this depended on when they moved and how far they thought they had already gone. "Do you have the date?" I asked. He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning. 10:30. They have a buyer, an agent, and preliminary agreements in place." For a second, the room felt quieter, like the air itself had shifted, like everything had aligned in a way that made what was coming unavoidable. "They are going to try to sell something they do not own," I said, more as a statement than a question, and Daniel closed the file halfway, his eyes meeting mine with the same steady confidence he had shown me 3 years ago. "They are going to try," he corrected gently, and that distinction mattered more than anything, because it meant there was a line they had not crossed yet, a point where everything would stop, not because they chose to, but because they would have no other option. I thought back to the last time my father talked about selling property, the way he stood in the living room explaining market timing, interest rates, buyer demand, speaking like someone who understood the system completely, like someone who could predict outcomes with certainty, and I remember standing there, listening, knowing he was right about most of it, knowing he was experienced, knowledgeable, confident, and still missing something fundamental, something he never considered because it never applied to him, the possibility that someone else in the equation had more control than he realized. "We let them proceed," I said after a moment, and Daniel did not hesitate. "Of course," he replied, because that had always been part of the plan, not to stop them early, not to warn them, not to interrupt the process before it reached its peak, but to let it unfold fully, to let them commit, to let them stand in front of other people and declare something as fact before that fact was taken apart piece by piece. "The agent, the buyer, anyone involved will be present," he continued, "which means the correction will not be private." I nodded because that was exactly what mattered, not just the outcome, but where and how it happened, because quiet victories disappear, but public ones leave something behind, something that cannot be ignored or rewritten later. I glanced down at the file again, at the pages that represented years of quiet work, of decisions made without recognition, of effort that no one in my family had ever acknowledged because they never saw it happening, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to clarity, not anger, not even satisfaction, just a steady understanding of what this was. "They think they removed me," I said quietly, almost to myself, and Daniel closed the file completely now, placing his hand on top of it like he was sealing something in place. "They removed themselves from the truth," he replied, and that sentence stayed with me, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it was simple, direct, and accurate in a way that did not need anything else added to it. I stood up slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft sound against the floor, and walked toward the window, looking out at the street below, at people moving through their day without realizing how quickly things could change when assumptions were tested against reality. "Tomorrow at 10:30, I said, repeating it to anchor the moment, to mark the point where everything would shift from preparation to exposure. "We will be there," Daniel confirmed, and I nodded once, turning back toward the door, my hand resting briefly on the handle before I opened it, because there was nothing left to plan, nothing left to prepare, only one thing left to do, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I realized something that made everything feel even clearer. They thought they had already taken everything from me. They had no idea they were about to lose something much bigger. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to see everything before it started, to observe the setup, the confidence, the assumptions settling into place like they always did when people believed they were in control. And as I pulled up to the curb across the street, I saw them already there, my parents standing near the front walkway, dressed like this was an important day, like this was a milestone, like they were about to close something significant, and in a way they were, just not in the way they expected. A black SUV was parked behind their car, and a man in a tailored suit stood beside it, checking his watch, flipping through a folder, the kind of quiet impatience that comes from someone who values time and expects others to do the same. And a few steps away, a woman with a tablet was speaking to my mother, her voice light, professional, reassuring, the tone of someone who had done this many times before and saw no reason why today would be any different. I stayed in the car for a moment, watching, letting the scene unfold without me, because this part mattered, this illusion of normalcy, this belief that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. My phone read 10:24 a.m. 6 minutes. I stepped out of the car, the door closing with a soft click that no one seemed to notice at first, and I walked toward them at an even pace, not rushed, not hesitant, just present, and it was my mother who saw me first, her expression tightening instantly, like my appearance was an inconvenience she had not accounted for. "What are you doing here?" she said, her voice low but sharp enough to carry, and the agent turned slightly, her polite smile shifting into something more neutral, more observant, as she took in the situation. My father followed my mother's gaze, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not surprised, not concerned, just irritated, like I had shown up late to something I was no longer invited to. "This is not your concern anymore, Emily," he said, stepping slightly forward, positioning himself between me and the others, a subtle but deliberate move, one that said more than his words did, one that showed exactly how he viewed this moment, as something to manage, something to control, something to keep contained. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to be part of the conversation, far enough to avoid stepping into the space he was trying to define. "I think it is," I replied calmly, and I could see the agent's attention sharpen, the buyer glancing up from his folder, sensing the shift even if he did not yet understand it. "We are in the middle of a transaction," my father said, his tone tightening now, the patience thinning just enough to reveal the edge underneath, "and you are not part of it." Not part of it. The phrase settled in the air, and for a moment, I let it stay there, let everyone hear it, let it anchor the scene exactly where it needed to be before anything changed. "Actually," I said, my voice steady, measured, "that depends on what you are selling." The agent straightened slightly, her professional instincts kicking in, her eyes moving between us now, evaluating, recalibrating, and the buyer closed his folder halfway, his earlier impatience replaced by a quiet caution, the kind that appears when something unexpected enters a deal. "We are selling this property," my father replied, gesturing toward the house behind him, his confidence returning quickly, because in his mind, this was simple, clear, uncontested. "Then you should make sure you have the right to do that," I said, and that was the moment everything slowed just a fraction, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for the shift to begin, enough for the certainty in his posture to hesitate for the first time. "Of course we do," my mother cut in quickly, her voice sharper now, defensive in a way she tried to mask with authority. "This is our house." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, I saw something I had not expected, not doubt exactly, but a flicker of something close to it, something that passed so quickly most people would have missed it, but I had spent years watching these moments, learning to recognize the smallest cracks before they spread. "That is what you believe," I said quietly, and behind me, I heard the sound of a car door closing, followed by measured footsteps approaching, steady, unhurried, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. "Good morning," Daniel's voice came from just behind my shoulder, calm, composed, carrying exactly the right amount of authority without raising itself above the situation, and when I stepped slightly to the side, giving him a clear view of the group, I watched as the dynamic shifted again, more noticeably this time, because now it was no longer just a family disagreement, now there was structure, documentation, presence. "I am Daniel Reeves, representing Emily Carter," he said, his gaze moving briefly to each person, acknowledging them without inviting interruption, "and before you proceed, there is a matter regarding ownership that needs to be addressed." The agent's posture changed immediately, her tablet lowering slightly as she focused fully on him, the buyer straightening, his earlier impatience replaced by alert attention, and my father's expression hardened, not in confidence this time, but in resistance, like he was preparing to push back against something he did not yet understand. "There is no issue with ownership," my father said firmly, but the certainty in his voice did not land the same way it had before, not with Daniel standing there, not with the others watching, not with the moment already beginning to shift. Daniel nodded once, not dismissing the statement, not arguing, just acknowledging it as part of the process before he opened the folder in his hands. "We will clarify that," he said, and as the papers inside caught the light, as the reality of what was about to be presented moved from theory into view, I realized something that made everything feel even more precise. This was the last moment they would believe they were right. Daniel did not rush as he opened the folder, and that was the first thing that shifted the air around us, not the papers themselves, not even the words he was about to say, but the pace, the controlled, deliberate way he handled the moment like it already belonged to him, like this was not an interruption but a continuation of something already decided. "Before any transaction proceeds," he said, his voice even, professional, carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear without forcing attention, "it is standard practice to confirm clear and uncontested ownership." The agent nodded instinctively, her training taking over, her earlier confidence now tempered with caution as she stepped slightly closer, her tablet lowered, her full attention on the documents in Daniel's hands. My father let out a short breath, something between impatience and dismissal. "We have already done that," he said, his tone tightening, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Everything has been filed and verified." Daniel glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just acknowledging the statement before returning his focus to the papers. "That is correct," he replied, "you have filed documentation." That pause, that subtle distinction, landed heavier than anything louder could have, and I saw it immediately, the way the buyer's posture shifted, the way the agent's eyes narrowed slightly, processing the difference between filing something and having it hold. However, Daniel continued, turning the first page so that it faced outward just enough for the agent to see. Filing does not override recorded ownership under a separate legal entity. The agent stepped closer now, her professional distance closing as she leaned in slightly, scanning the header, the signatures, the recorded stamp at the bottom of the page, and I watched her expression change in real time, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, like someone adjusting to new information that did not fit the assumption they had walked in with. "This property," Daniel said, tapping lightly on the page, "along with the surrounding parcels, is registered under Carter Holdings LLC." My mother's head snapped slightly toward me, her eyes searching my face for something, confusion, denial, anything that would make sense of what she was hearing, but I did not look away. I did not react, I just stood there, steady, because this was not new to me, this was simply the first time it was being said out loud in front of her. "That is not possible," my father said quickly, the words coming faster now, less controlled, less measured. "We have the deed." Daniel nodded once, almost gently. "You have a deed," he corrected, and that word, that single shift, changed the entire structure of the statement, "but the land it sits on, along with the adjacent properties, has been acquired, transferred, and recorded under Ms. Carter's entity over the past 3 years. The buyer straightened fully now, his folder closing completely as he stepped forward, no longer a passive observer but someone directly affected by what was being said. "Are you saying this transaction cannot proceed?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with concern, the kind of concern that comes when a deal starts to unravel in ways that are not easily fixed. Daniel did not hesitate. "I am saying that the individuals attempting to sell this property do not have the authority to do so," he replied, his tone unchanged, still calm, still precise, but now carrying the weight of finality. The agent exhaled. Slowly, stepping back half a pace, her posture shifting from facilitation to reassessment, her eyes moving between my parents, the documents, and me, recalculating everything she thought she knew about this transaction. "We need to pause," she said, her voice professional but firm, addressing the buyer now as much as anyone else, "until this is fully clarified." My father's jaw tightened, the controlled confidence he had held onto starting to fracture, not in a dramatic way, but in small, visible ways, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes moved more quickly now, searching for something to hold onto. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, but the certainty was gone from his voice, replaced by something thinner, something less stable. "Then it will be easy to resolve," Daniel replied, closing the folder halfway, but not removing it, keeping it present, visible, undeniable. "We can review the full record of ownership transfers, including each parcel on this street, all filed under Carter Holdings LLC." There was a silence then, not empty, but heavy, filled with the weight of what had just been introduced, and for the first time since this began, no one spoke immediately, no one rushed to fill the space, because the structure of the situation had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet fully understand it. My mother looked at me again, her expression no longer sharp or dismissive, but searching, uncertain in a way I had never seen before, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of me that did not match, the one she thought she knew, and the one standing in front of her now. "Emily," she said slowly, my name sounding different in her voice this time, less like a command, more like a question, "what is he talking about?" I held her gaze for a moment, long enough for the silence to stretch just slightly further, long enough for the reality to settle into the space between us, and then I answered, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. "He is explaining ownership," I said, and I could see it then, the exact moment it began to land, not fully, not all at once, but enough to change everything that came after, because this was no longer about a house, no longer about an eviction, no longer about who was allowed to stand on that porch. This was about control, and for the first time, they were starting to realize they did not have it. The silence did not break immediately, and that was the part no one expected, not the agent, not the buyer, and definitely not my parents, because they were used to filling silence with control, with explanations, with certainty, but this was different. This silence was not empty, it was full of something settling into place, something irreversible. The agent was the first to move, stepping closer to Daniel, her hand extending slightly as she asked, "May I?" her tone professional but careful now, and Daniel handed her the top document without hesitation, because there was nothing to hide, nothing to soften, nothing to reinterpret. She scanned the page quickly at first, then again more slowly, her eyes moving line by line, checking names, dates, registration numbers, and I watched the exact moment her posture changed, the subtle straightening, the shift from assumption to verification, the realization that this was no longer a routine transaction. These filings are recorded with the county, she said, more to herself than to anyone else, but loud enough for everyone to hear, and Daniel nodded once. They are, he confirmed, each parcel transferred individually over a 3-year period. The buyer stepped closer now, his earlier distance gone completely, his focus fixed on the document in her hands. What parcels? He asked, his voice sharper now, more direct, because this was no longer abstract, this was affecting him, his time, his money, his decision. The agent turned slightly, angling the paper so he could see, her finger tracing down a list that seemed longer than expected. All adjacent properties on this street, she said, and that was the moment it expanded, the moment it moved beyond a single house, beyond a simple disagreement, into something much larger. My father shook his head quickly, almost reflexively, like rejecting the idea would make it less real. That is irrelevant, he said, his voice rising just enough to push against the growing tension. We are selling this house, not the entire street. Daniel did not react to the volume, did not match it, did not challenge it, he simply waited until the words settled before responding. The structure you are attempting to sell is physically located on land that is part of a larger recorded ownership, he said, his tone unchanged. Still calm, still precise, and that land is not in your name. The buyer exhaled slowly, stepping back half a pace, his expression shifting from interest to concern in a way that was impossible to miss now. So the property line is not what was presented, he said, not asking, but confirming what he was beginning to understand. The agent nodded slightly, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful neutrality. We need to verify boundaries and ownership before proceeding, she said, her voice firm now, procedural, the kind of tone that ends movement until clarity is restored. My mother looked between them, her composure slipping in small, visible ways, the way her hands tightened around each other, the way her eyes moved faster now, searching for something stable to hold on to. Emily, she said again, but this time my name sounded different, less controlled, more uncertain, like she was reaching for something she did not understand. I did not answer immediately, not because I could not, but because this moment did not need more words from me, it needed space for what was already happening to unfold. My father stepped forward again, trying to reclaim ground that was no longer his to define. This is a technical issue, he said, forcing steadiness back into his voice, something that can be corrected with the right paperwork. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. It is a legal issue, he corrected calmly, and it cannot be corrected retroactively without the consent of the recorded owner. That sentence landed differently, heavier, more final, because it introduced something they had not yet fully accepted, not just that there was a problem, but that the solution did not belong to them. The buyer looked directly at me then, his expression no longer distant or neutral, but focused, evaluating, understanding that I was no longer just part of the background of this situation, I was central to it. Are you the recorded owner? He asked, and for the first time since this began, the question was directed at me clearly, openly, without assumption. I met his gaze, steady, without hesitation. Yes, I said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else that had been said so far, because it did not argue, it did not explain, it simply existed as fact. The agent exhaled again, this time more noticeably. Stepping back fully now, her role shifting from facilitator to observer of a halted process. We cannot proceed with this transaction, she said, her voice clear, professional, final, and that was the moment everything stopped, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. My father did not speak immediately, and that was new, that was different, because he always had something to say, always had a response, always had a way to reframe the situation, but now there was a pause, a real one, the kind that comes when the structure you are relying on is no longer holding. My mother looked at me again, and this time there was no sharpness, no dismissal, just something else, something quieter, something closer to realization. You did this, she said, not as an accusation, not entirely, but as a statement she was still trying to understand. I held her gaze, steady, calm, and for a moment, everything felt clear in a way it never had before. No, I said quietly, I prepared for it. And that was the difference they were only just beginning to see. The word prepared did not land the way an argument would have, it did not invite a response or create a space for negotiation, it simply existed, and that was what made it heavier than anything else I could have said, because it meant this was not reaction, this was not emotion, this was not something done in the moment, it was something built over time, something intentional, something they had never once considered I was capable of. My father let out a slow breath, his eyes moving from me to Daniel and back again, recalculating, adjusting, searching for something to regain control of a situation that was no longer responding to him. If what you are saying is true, he began, his tone shifting into something more measured now, less forceful, more strategic, then this is a matter of internal family ownership, and it can be resolved privately. Privately. That word hung in the air, and I could see exactly what he was trying to do, trying to move this out of the open, away from the agent, away from the buyer, away from anyone who could witness the shift, because if it stayed public, it would not just be a correction, it would be a collapse of everything he had presented as fact. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause was deliberate, giving the weight of the word time to settle before answering. Ownership is not determined by family relationships, he said calmly, it is determined by recorded legal entities and documented transfers. The agent nodded slightly, almost instinctively, her role now fully aligned with verification rather than facilitation, and the buyer crossed his arms loosely, no longer engaged in the purchase, but fully engaged in understanding what had just happened. So what happens now, he asked, directing the question to Daniel but glancing at me, recognizing that the answer, ultimately, rested with me. Daniel closed the folder completely this time, holding it at his side rather than presenting it, signaling that the explanation phase was over and the outcome phase had begun. The current listing is invalid, he said, his tone clear, procedural, and any further attempt to transfer ownership without authorization would be legally contested. The agent exhaled slowly, stepping back another half step, creating space between herself and my parents, not physically distancing in a dramatic way, but enough to signal a shift in alignment, enough to show that she was no longer standing with them in this process. We will have to withdraw the listing, she said, her voice steady, professional, but no longer neutral, now aligned with the reality that had been established. My mother shook her head slightly, the movement small but persistent, like she was trying to undo something that had already happened. This does not make sense, she said, her voice quieter now, less sharp, more strained. You lived in that house your whole life, you never. She stopped herself, the sentence trailing off as if she realized, too late, that what she was about to say only confirmed what she had always believed, that I was someone who stayed in place, someone who did not move beyond what was given to her. I watched her for a moment, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to explain myself, because the explanation was already in front of her, in documents, in facts, in outcomes she could not dismiss. You never asked, I said simply, and that was not accusation, not even criticism, just a statement, just the truth of how things had always been. My father's expression tightened again, but this time it was different, not the sharp control from before, not the dismissive certainty, but something more contained, more internal, like he was trying to process multiple layers of information at once and finding that none of them aligned with what he had expected. You are saying you own all of this, he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled, but lacking the authority it once carried, every property on this street. I nodded once, not expanding, not adding emphasis, because it did not need it. The buyer let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly in a way that was not disbelief, but recognition of a situation that had shifted beyond his involvement. I am going to step away from this, he said, his tone polite but final, closing the last connection he had to the transaction. The agent nodded in agreement, already turning slightly as if preparing to leave, her role here complete now that the situation had been clarified. And just like that, the structure my parents had built for this moment, the plan, the presentation, the expectation of a clean sale, began to dissolve, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, piece by piece, person by person, until there was nothing left to hold it together. My mother looked at me again, and this time there was no confusion, no sharpness, just something else, something quieter, something that took longer to form. Why did you not tell us, she asked, and for a second, the question hung there, simple on the surface, but layered with everything underneath it. I held her gaze, steady, and answered the only way that made sense. Because you already decided who I was, I said, my voice calm, even, and I decided to become something else. The silence that followed was not the same as before, not filled with tension or uncertainty, but with something more final, something settled, because this was the moment where there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to deny, only one thing left to face, and I could see it in their expressions, the realization that what they thought they controlled had never actually belonged to them. The buyer's car door closed with a quiet, final sound that seemed louder than anything else that had happened, not because of the noise itself, but because of what it represented, the end of something my parents thought was guaranteed, the disappearance of a future they had already started to count on, and as the engine started and the vehicle pulled away, I watched my father follow it with his eyes for just a second too long, like he was trying to hold onto it even as it was already gone. The agent gathered her tablet, her posture now fully professional again, but distant, detached, no longer connected to them in any meaningful way. "I will be in touch once this is reviewed further," she said, her tone polite but clearly signaling closure, not continuation, and without waiting for a response, she stepped away, her heels clicking lightly against the pavement as she moved toward her car, leaving behind a space that felt noticeably emptier than before. And then it was just us. No audience, no transaction, no structure to hold things together, just the three of us standing on a street that suddenly felt very different from the one they thought they owned. My mother was the first to speak, her voice quieter now, almost careful, like she was testing each word before letting it out. "Emily, we did not know," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something that sounded like an explanation but not quite an apology, like she was trying to find a position that did not require her to fully confront what had just happened. I looked at her for a moment, not searching for anything, just observing, because this was another pattern I recognized, the shift from certainty to justification, from control to reinterpretation. "That is the point," I said calmly, and the words were not sharp, not emotional, just direct, just true. My father finally turned his attention back to me, his expression no longer tight with control, but something else now, something more contained, more deliberate, like he was choosing his next move carefully instead of assuming it. "If this is about leverage," he said, his voice steady but lower than before, "then you have made your point." Leverage. The word felt misplaced, like he was still trying to fit this into a framework he understood, something transactional, something strategic, something that could be negotiated or resolved with the right terms. I shook my head slightly. "It is not about leverage," I replied, and for a second, he held my gaze, like he was waiting for something more, something that would bring this back into familiar territory, but nothing came, because there was nothing to negotiate. My mother took a small step forward, her hands still clasped together, but less tightly now, her posture softer in a way I had never really seen before. "Then what do you want?" she asked, and that question, simple as it sounded, carried more weight than anything else she had said, because it assumed something new, that I had a position, that I had control, that I was the one deciding what came next. I let the silence sit for a moment, not to create tension, but because the answer did not need to be rushed, did not need to be shaped to fit their expectations. "Nothing," I said finally, and that was the truth, not the kind that sounds dramatic, not the kind that demands reaction, just a quiet, steady reality. My father frowned slightly, like the answer did not fit, like it disrupted whatever path he had been preparing to take. "That does not make sense," he said, and there was a hint of frustration there now, not directed outward, but inward, like he was trying to resolve something that would not align. "It does," I replied, my voice even, "you made your decision yesterday." I could see it then, the moment it connected, not fully, not all at once, but enough for the shift to begin, enough for him to understand that this was not a continuation of the same dynamic, this was not a situation where he could adjust terms or reframe outcomes, this was something else entirely. My mother's expression changed again, something softer, something closer to realization settling in. "We were trying to do what was best," she said, and the words sounded familiar, not because they were new, but because I had heard versions of them my entire life, explanations that justified decisions without ever fully examining them. I did not interrupt her, did not argue, because there was no need to revisit something that had already played out. "You did what you believed was best," I said, correcting it slightly, not to challenge her, but to place it where it belonged, in their perspective, not in reality. My father looked at the house behind him then, the front door, the windows, the structure that had been the center of this entire situation, and for a moment, his expression shifted in a way I had never seen before, not anger, not control, but something closer to uncertainty, like he was seeing it differently now, not as something he owned, but as something he no longer understood. "So what happens to the house?" he asked, and that question was different from the others, not defensive, not strategic, just practical, just grounded in what was left after everything else had been stripped away. I followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him. "It stays where it is," I said simply, and that answer seemed to settle into the space between us in a way that did not require anything more, because this was no longer about movement, no longer about taking or giving, it was about understanding what already existed. My mother nodded slowly, like she was absorbing something that would take time to fully process, and my father remained still for a moment longer before exhaling quietly, the kind of breath that comes when something has shifted in a way you cannot reverse. I adjusted the strap of my bag slightly on my shoulder, not as a signal, not as a gesture, just a small movement before stepping back, creating space, not out of distance, but out of completion, because there was nothing left to resolve here, nothing left to prove. And as I turned to walk away, I did not feel the need to look back, because for the first time, I knew exactly where everything stood, and more importantly, so did they. I did not walk far before I heard my name again, not sharp this time, not controlling, just quieter, almost unfamiliar in the way it carried across the space between us, and I stopped, not immediately, not in a way that suggested urgency, but just enough to acknowledge it without turning the moment into something it was not. "Emily," my father said, and when I finally turned back, there was something different in the way he stood, not the rigid posture from before, not the calculated authority, but something more measured, like he was choosing each movement instead of relying on habit. I waited, saying nothing, because whatever he had to say now needed to come without interruption, without guidance, without the structure he was used to leaning on. He took a step forward, then stopped, like he was aware of the distance between us in a way he had never been before. "You should have told us," he said, and the words sounded less like a command and more like a conclusion he had reached too late, something he could not change but still felt the need to say. I held his gaze, steady, not defensive, not reactive, just present. "You would not have believed me," I replied, and that was not an accusation, not even criticism, just the truth of how things had always worked between us, how information was filtered, accepted, or dismissed based on expectations that had been set long before I had any say in them. My mother stepped closer now, her movement slower, more deliberate, like she was navigating something unfamiliar. "We could have understood," she said, but even as she spoke, there was hesitation in her voice, a slight uncertainty that made the statement feel less solid than she intended. I did not respond immediately, because the answer to that was not simple, not something that fit into a single sentence, but I knew what mattered was not explaining the past, it was acknowledging what had already happened. "You had years," I said quietly, and the words settled into the space between us without force, without emphasis, just a simple marker of time, of opportunity, of everything that had been overlooked. My father exhaled again, slower this time, and I could see the shift continuing, not dramatic, not complete, but real, the kind of shift that does not reverse once it starts. "And now," he said, his voice lower, more grounded, "we do not." That was the first thing he had said that fully aligned with the reality in front of him, not framed as control, not presented as a solution, just an acknowledgement of position, and for a moment, I let that sit, because it mattered, because it meant he was starting to see this not as something to manage, but as something to understand. "No," I said simply, and there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just clarity. My mother looked past me then, down the street, at the row of houses that had always been part of the background of our lives, and I could tell she was seeing them differently now, not just as neighbors, not just as structures, but as something connected, something that had been changing without her ever noticing. "All of it," she said softly, more to herself than to me, and I did not correct her, did not expand, because the realization was already forming, already settling into place without needing to be guided. My father followed her gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, both of them standing there in a silence that was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective in a way that had not existed before. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked after a while, and the question was different now, not strategic, not probing for weakness, just genuine, just direct. I considered it for a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because the answer did not need to be complicated. "Keep it," I said, and that was enough, not because it explained everything, but because it did not need to. My mother nodded slowly, like she was accepting something piece by piece, and my father remained still for a moment longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting the strap of my bag again, the same small movement as before, but this time it felt different, not like preparation to leave, but like a transition already in motion. "Emily," my mother said once more, and when I looked at her, there was something softer in her expression, something that had not been there before, not fully formed, not clearly defined but present. "If you ever," she began, then stopped, the sentence unfinished, like she was not sure how to complete it without stepping into something she did not yet understand. I did not push her to finish it, did not ask, because whatever she was trying to say would take more than a single moment to become clear. "Take care of yourself," I said instead, and the words were simple, neutral, not distant, not close, just exactly what they needed to be. My father looked at me one last time, his expression steady now, not resolved, not completely shifted, but different enough to matter, and then he nodded once more, a small, contained gesture that said more than anything else he could have said in that moment. I turned again, this time without stopping, without hesitation, and as I walked back toward the car, the street felt quieter, not because anything had changed physically, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said, everything that needed to shift had already begun. When I reached the car, I paused for just a second, my hand resting on the door handle, and I let the moment settle one last time, not as an ending, not as a victory, but as something complete, something that no longer required my presence to continue. Then I opened the door, got in, and drove away, leaving behind not just the house, but the version of myself they had always believed in, because that version no longer existed, and for the first time, they knew it. By the time I reached the main road, the street behind me had already begun to fade into something quieter, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer central, and as I drove, I kept my speed steady, not rushing, not slowing, just moving forward in a way that felt intentional, like every mile created distance not just physically, but structurally, separating what had been from what was already taking shape. My phone remained silent for most of the drive, which was exactly what I expected, because silence, in this case, did not mean nothing was happening, it meant everything was being processed, reviewed, reconsidered in a way that would take time, especially for people who had spent years operating within a version of reality that no longer applied. When I finally pulled into the parking structure near the office building, the same one I had been to the day before, the familiar gray concrete levels and echoing footsteps grounded me in something consistent, something that had not shifted overnight, and as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the elevator, I realized how different that felt compared to the house, compared to everything that had been tied to expectations I no longer carried. Inside the office, Daniel was already waiting, not standing this time, not preparing documents, but seated behind his desk with the file closed in front of him, like the active part of the process had already been completed, and what remained was simply confirmation. "It is done," he said as I stepped inside, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no need for it, just a clear statement of fact that matched exactly what had unfolded. I nodded once, taking a seat across from him, not out of habit, but because this space, this structure, had become something familiar in a way that did not require explanation. "They will likely review everything," he continued, "possibly consult their own counsel, but the outcome will not change." I leaned back slightly, not in relief, not in exhaustion, just in acknowledgement, because this had never been about uncertainty, it had always been about timing, about when the reality would intersect with their assumptions. "They will understand eventually," I said, and Daniel gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as recognition of the process that always follows something like this, the gradual shift from denial to comprehension. "And you," he added after a moment, "what will you do next?" The question was simple, direct, and for a second, I considered it, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was not tied to anything immediate, not reactive, not dependent on what had just happened. "Continue," I said, and that was enough, because there was nothing to prove, nothing to establish beyond what already existed. Daniel allowed himself a slight smile, the kind that appears when something aligns exactly as expected, not surprising, but still worth acknowledging. "That is usually the correct approach," he replied, and with that, the conversation settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be extended further. I stood after a moment, adjusting the strap of my bag again, the same small, consistent motion that marked transitions without needing to signal them, and as I moved toward the door, Daniel spoke once more. If they reach out, he said, not as a warning, not as a suggestion, just as a consideration, you will know how to proceed. I paused briefly, my hand resting on the door handle, and nodded without turning back, because that was also true, not because of anything specific, but because I understood the structure now, understood where everything stood without needing to revisit it. Outside, the air felt different than it had the day before, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something had been resolved at a level that did not depend on external confirmation. I walked back toward the parking structure, the sound of my steps echoing slightly against the concrete, and for a moment, I thought about the street again, not as a place, not as a memory but as something defined by ownership, by structure, by decisions made over time that had finally become visible. My phone buzzed once as I reached my car, and this time, when I looked down, I saw my mother's name, not a number, not unknown, but familiar in a way that carried history, and for a second, I simply looked at it, not answering immediately, not rejecting it, just observing the moment for what it was, a continuation of something that had already shifted. The screen lit up again with a second message before I responded. We need to talk, it read, simple, direct, different from anything she had sent before, because it did not assume control, did not define the terms, it simply acknowledged that something had changed. I opened the message, then locked the screen again without replying, not out of avoidance, not out of hesitation, but because the timing mattered, because this was no longer a situation where immediate response defined the outcome. I got into the car, started the engine, and sat there for a second, the quiet hum filling the space, and I realized something that had not been clear before, not fully, not until now. This was not about what they lost. It was about what I built. And for the first time, there was no one left to question it, no one left to dismiss it, no one left to redefine it into something smaller. It simply existed, exactly as it was, and that was enough. I did not answer that day, and I did not answer the next morning either, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood something now that I had never understood before, that not every message required an immediate response, not every conversation needed to happen the moment someone else decided it should, and as I went through my day, reviewing reports, checking numbers, moving through meetings that had nothing to do with what had happened but everything to do with what I had built, I felt something settle into place, something steady that did not shift depending on who was speaking, or what they expected from me. By the afternoon, the message thread had grown, not in volume, but in tone, each line from my mother slightly different from the last, moving from direct to careful, from assumption to uncertainty, and when I finally opened them again, I read them slowly, not searching for meaning, but recognizing the change. We should talk today, the first message said, still holding onto a sense of urgency that belonged to her, not to me. The next one was shorter. Please call when you can. And the last one, sent just an hour earlier, was the simplest of all. I would like to understand. I stared at that sentence for a moment longer than the others, not because it was dramatic, but because it was new, because it was the first time I had seen her approach something without defining it first, without deciding what it meant before asking what it was. I locked my phone again and leaned back slightly in my chair, the office around me quiet, the soft hum of the building settling into the background, and I thought about the street again, not as a place I had left behind, but as something that no longer needed my presence to exist, something that had been resolved in a way that did not require constant attention or defense. When my phone rang a few minutes later, I did not hesitate this time, not because I felt obligated, but because the timing felt different, because the shift had already happened and this was simply the next step in understanding it. Hello, I said, my voice even, the word simple, unweighted by anything else. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, but noticeable, like she was adjusting to the fact that I had answered, like she was recalibrating something she had not expected. Emily, my mother said, and her voice sounded softer than it had before, not uncertain, but careful in a way that suggested she was choosing each word more deliberately than she ever had. Thank you for picking up. I did not respond to that directly, not because it was not acknowledged, but because the conversation did not need to start there. You said you wanted to understand, I said instead, keeping the focus where it belonged on the reason for the call, not the structure of it. There was another brief pause, and then she exhaled slowly. I do, she said, and this time there was no hesitation in it, just a clear statement, simple and direct. I do not understand when this started, how this happened, why we did not see it. I listened without interrupting, not because I needed to hear every detail, but because this was the first time she was asking instead of assuming, the first time she was opening space instead of filling it. It did not start all at once, I said after a moment, my tone calm, steady. It started the day you decided I did not need the same things as everyone else. The line went quiet for a second, not disconnected, just silent, the kind of silence that forms when something lands in a way that cannot be immediately answered. That was not what we meant, she said finally, her voice softer now, less certain, like she was trying to adjust the past into something more understandable. I know, I replied, and I meant it, because intention and outcome are not always the same, and understanding that difference had been part of what allowed me to move forward without carrying everything with me. But it is what happened. She did not argue with that, and that alone said more than anything else could have, because it meant she was beginning to separate what she believed from what had actually taken place. We thought you were independent, she said after a moment, and I could hear the shift in her voice, not defensive, not dismissive, but reflective in a way that felt new. You never asked for anything. I let that sit for a second before answering, because the response mattered, not in its complexity, but in its clarity. I learned not to, I said, and that was all it needed to be, not expanded, not explained, just stated as it was. The silence that followed was longer this time, but not uncomfortable, not tense, just filled with the weight of something being understood piece by piece. And everything after that, she said slowly, almost thinking out loud, the properties, the company, all of it, you did that on your own. It was not a question, not exactly, more like a realization forming as she spoke. Yes, I said, and there was no emphasis in it, no need for it, because it was not something that needed validation, it simply existed as fact. I wish we had known, she said quietly, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that did not try to reshape what had happened, something that simply acknowledged it without trying to correct it. I did not respond to that immediately, because some things do not need answers, some things just need to be said. What happens now? She asked after a moment, and that question was different from before, not about control, not about outcome, just about direction, about what comes next when the past has already settled into place. I looked out the window for a second, the city moving as it always did, unchanged by any one conversation, any one moment, and I understood something clearly then. That depends, I said, my voice calm, steady, on whether you are asking as my parents or as people who are ready to listen. And that was where the conversation shifted again, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that mattered more than anything else that had been said. There was a pause on the line after I said that, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that carries weight, the kind that asks for something real in return, and for the first time, my mother did not rush to fill it, did not try to reshape the question into something easier to answer, she simply stayed there, present in a way I had not heard before. I am asking as someone who wants to listen, she said finally, her voice steady but softer than I had ever known it, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of emotion, but to let that settle, because words like that only matter if they are followed by something different, something consistent, something that does not disappear when it becomes uncomfortable. Then start by not deciding who I am before I speak, I said, my tone calm, even, not distant, not warm, just clear, because clarity was the only thing that mattered now. There was no immediate response, just a quiet acknowledgement on the other end, something small but real, and for a moment that was enough. We made mistakes, she said after a while, and the words were simple, unadorned, without explanation attached to them, without conditions, and that was new, that was different, because they stood on their own without trying to redirect anything else. I did not respond right away, not because I rejected it, but because I understood something now that I had not before, that acknowledgement is not something you rush to accept or reject, it is something you allow to exist, and then watch what follows it. I know, I said quietly, and that was all it needed to be, not forgiveness, not resolution, just recognition. The line stayed open for a moment longer, neither of us speaking, and then she exhaled softly. I would like to try again, she said, and there was something in her voice that did not sound like certainty, but something closer to effort, to intention, to something that had not existed before. I looked out the window again, the city moving as it always did, steady, unaffected by any one moment, and I understood that this was not something that would resolve in a single conversation, not something that would be fixed by words alone. It would take time, consistency, change that could be seen, not just heard. We will see, I said, and it was not rejection, not acceptance, just truth, because that was the only honest answer I could give. She did not push, did not try to turn it into something more immediate, and that, more than anything, told me she had heard what I said. Okay, she replied, and the call ended shortly after, not abruptly, not awkwardly, just naturally, like something that had reached its point for now. I set my phone down and sat there for a moment, letting everything settle, not replaying it, not analyzing it, just allowing it to exist as it was, because this was not about perfect endings or dramatic conclusions, it was about understanding where things stood and what might come next. And as I sat there, I realized something that had not been clear before, not fully, not until now, that what happened on that street was never just about property, never just about ownership or control. It was about being seen for what you are capable of, about building something quietly when no one is paying attention, about choosing who you become instead of accepting who others decide you are. People often think that power is something loud, something visible, something that announces itself in big moments, but real power is quiet. It is built in decisions no one notices, in effort no one applauds, in consistency that does not need recognition to exist. And sometimes, the hardest part is not proving others wrong, it is realizing that you do not need their approval to be right. Family, in its best form, is not about control or expectation, it is about understanding, about making space for each other to grow into something different without losing connection. And when that space is missing, people either shrink to fit it or expand beyond it. I chose to expand, not to leave them behind, but because staying the same would have meant losing myself. And in the end, what matters is not who was right or wrong in a single moment, but whether people are willing to see each other clearly after everything changes, because that is where real connection begins, not in what we assume, but in what we are finally ready to understand.